By now, I'd imagine that most people in the gaming community have heard of and even played the internet-breaking game known as palworld. I myself have spent countless hours on my own time with friends and even on my live streams playing this game. All I have to say about the game is that it is a ton of freaking fun. Not only is this game an absolute juggernaut in the gaming community as a whole right now, but it's also been giving a certain company a lot more flack from their community. And based on the title and thumbnail of this video, you probably know what we're about to be talking about. So let's get into it. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the latest additions to the mainline Pokemon video game series and the first open-world Pokemon game in the franchise's history. Nintendo and Game Freak have finally one-upped themselves in terms of moving the Pokemon franchise forward in the future of gaming. Or have they? The sales data for these two games would definitely suggest that this is the case. Not to mention the fact that each version of the game costs a staggering $60. So it must be a good product if it costs as much as all the other AAA titles in the industry right now, right? Not to mention the $40 DLCs per version for Scarlet and Violet. To be fair, they aren't the only Nintendo published games that have launched with a fairly high cost and haven't been reduced since, because almost all games with a Nintendo IP have cost the same amount since their respective releases. Nintendo overpricing Pokemon games is not really a surprise, especially considering that Pokemon Sword and Shield, which were the previous generation of mainline Pokemon games before Scarlet and Violet, still cost $60 each, not including the price of the DLCs. These are prices that are competing with games such as God of War, Baldur's Gate 3, Jedi Survivor, Spider-Man 2, Call of Duty. Well, to be fair, Call of Duty has become a very mid-franchise in my opinion, but at least it has decent graphics. And the list goes on. And once you look at all the flaws of Scarlet and Violet, you begin to wonder if Nintendo and Game Freak actually give a shit about this beloved franchise anymore, or if they and the rest of the Pokemon company are just thriving off of greed and selling whatever product they can come up with in a short amount of time because they know that Pokemon fans will just go out and buy it considering there's nothing else like it, or nothing that is innovated on that formula in the past couple decades now, until recently that is. Now, I get it. A lot of games nowadays have quite a few issues at launch, and then get periodic updates that attempt to solve these issues. Some good examples being Cyberpunk 2077, Fallout 76, and two that were just mentioned, Scarlet and Violet. This seems to be a common trope among AAA studios nowadays, and that hasn't been sitting well with us as the consumers of these botched products at launch. And with palworld's early access release recently, Nintendo's also been put in the spotlight for Pokemon's recent mainline games being so underwhelming and poorly performing. But even though Nintendo's the publisher of, and supposedly performs quality control on, these titles, they aren't the ones that actually develop the mainline Pokemon games. If you didn't know, Game Freak is the second party developer that actually develops the mainline Pokemon games. But that doesn't undermine the fact that Game Freak owns 1/3 of the Pokemon franchise, with Nintendo and Creatures, another development company that works closely with Game Freak on Pokemon modeling for the games, and also runs the Pokemon trading card game and Pokemon brand merchandising, each owning a piece of the remaining 2/3 of the Pokemon franchise. So Game Freak isn't just some secondary party that's on contract. In fact, it's probably one of the most well-known and profitable second-party game studios on the planet. And what it sounds like to me is that Game Freak's the main culprit for why these past generations of mainline Pokemon games have looked subpar and ran like trash. I mean, a lot of people got to thinking it was because of the Switch being an outdated console, which it totally is, don't get me wrong. But when you look at other titles that have released on the Switch, such as Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and even Super Mario Odyssey, you start seeing that the flaw doesn't seem to lie with the outdated system, but rather with the development of the games, which ultimately comes down to the studio that makes them. And if we look at the game development team behind Super Mario Odyssey, which is overseen by Nintendo themselves, then we'll notice something a little interesting when we compare the dev team from Odyssey to Game Freak's dev teams for the mainline Pokemon games. Odyssey had over 100 more staff working on Odyssey than Game Freak does working on the mainline Pokemon games. But they also gave themselves at least a year more of development time than Game Freak did for Scarlet and Violet. This shows that even with more people, Nintendo allowed its devs more time to make sure the game was as perfect as possible, and even allowed substantial time to perform quality control as well. Not only this, but they outsourced some of the game production to other companies to help with different assets of the game as well. This may have you thinking now, why doesn't the Pokemon Company outsource to other dev companies to help develop the mainline Pokemon games alongside Game Freak to take some of the load off? Well, the answer is that Game Freak doesn't want to. They want to keep the mainline Pokemon games internal to Game Freak alone, outside of Creatures creating the character models for them, that is. The statement is proven to be true as well, because Game Freak has stated in the past that they want to keep their team as small as possible to make sure their team is always on the same page throughout the development process. Now, it's understandable to want to keep your development team in sync throughout the entire development process, but when you have a smaller amount of time on some of the biggest titles in gaming with one of the smallest development teams out there, you begin to question if this is actually a good practice to keep running with. And when we look at other titles with the Pokemon IP, outside of the mainline series that is, the Pokemon Company has many different companies that work on these titles. Some examples being Pokemon Unite from Tencent and Timmy, Pokemon Go from Niantic, New Pokemon Snap from Bandai Namco Studios, and even Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which were the Diamond and Pearl remakes, were made by a different company called Ilka. The Pokemon Company, as a whole, is obviously not the reason why such a small number of developers are always working on the mainline Pokemon game series. That part is fully Game Freak's fault. So if Game Freak doesn't want to increase their staffing and grow their company, then why not just give them a little bit more time to work on the next games and also the DLCs? Well, to answer this, we need to talk about who's in charge of the release schedule for these mainline Pokemon games and DLCs. The official decision maker of when a Pokemon game needs to be released is not officially disclosed anywhere as far as I could find. But you can make the assumption that the Pokemon Company, aka TPC, as its own entity, has the ultimate say in when a Pokemon game needs to be released by Game Freak. I say this because even though Nintendo and Game Freak each own a third of the Pokemon Company, Nintendo and Game Freak don't make the ultimate decisions on what TPC itself wants to do with the entirety of the Pokemon franchise. Nintendo's there to publish games, and Game Freak's just there to create their mediocre mainline series. Now, I can almost guarantee that Nintendo's not trying to encourage Game Freak to rush these titles through development every time, because they've made more money from Mario Kart and Animal Crossing on the Switch than they have with Scarlet and Violet, let alone Sword and Shield. And if Nintendo supposedly has no motive to put such a stringent schedule on Game Freak, and Game Freak's flaws are keeping themselves too small and not innovating as much as they should have for the past couple of decades, then who's to blame for these subpar mainline Pokemon games and DLCs getting released so frequently? Well, I think there's an obvious outlier here. Now, we've talked about Nintendo and Game Freak quite a bit already, but there's still one owner of the franchise that we haven't really talked much about yet: Creatures. Creatures founder is Tsunekazu Ishihara, who was the CEO there until April 2023. Not only was he the CEO of Creatures, however, he's also simultaneously been the CEO of the Pokemon Company since its creation in 1998. Now, Ishihara's not the creator of Pokemon, he just runs the Pokemon Company as the enterprise that it is. The title of the creator of Pokemon actually falls on Satoshi Tajiri, who's the founder and current president of Game Freak. This is not to say that Ishihara had nothing to do with the creation of the first Pokemon games, because he was one of the key figures in helping create Pokemon Red and Green, so he's still been there since the beginning. As CEO of Creatures, Ishihara focused more of his time and energy, and still does to this day as TPC CEO, on the Pokemon trading card game, the animes, and the Pokemon brand merchandising in general. And the main way of bringing in new generations of Pokemon to the Pokemon franchise has been, and probably will be for the foreseeable future, by way of the mainline Pokemon video game series. So if Ishihara wants to bring out new cards for the Pokemon trading card game series, new stories to be told within the animes, and new merchandise to sell to the general public, then he needs new generations of Pokemon games to be released in as timely of a manner as he sees fit. And as long as these other moneymakers are bringing in the dough for TPC when a new generation releases, then who cares how well the video games perform, so long as they have the new Pokemon models from Creatures to work with, right? So these are the reasons why palworld, which is still in early access, is single-handedly showcasing what we could have had for the past few generations of the mainline Pokemon video game series, and why it's not necessarily Nintendo to put the full blame on. The games are developed by an understaffed, passionless development team at Game Freak, with Pokemon modeling done by Creatures, whose original CEO continues to control the entirety of the Pokemon franchise, and who cares more about the other assets of the company instead of the games that created the brand itself. And then having these games be sold to the unknowing fans after somehow passing quality control at Nintendo. Don't get me wrong, I am not trying to relieve Game Freak of the fact their current way of developing the mainline Pokemon video game series is highly inefficient and disrespectful to the fan base. I am trying to point out though, they may not have the final say in how much time they can actually get to work on these titles. However, they could definitely use some humbling and either hire more people or stop being so goddamn stubborn and take some cues from Papa Nintendo to start co-developing their games with companies that actually know what they're doing. Anyways, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think, and be sure to leave a like and subscribe on your way out if you're not yet. Also, feel free to stop by one of my live streams here or on Twitch. All my links are in the description down below. And with all that out of the way, see you guys next time. Peace.